Hello and good evening, both to those of us who are in the room, those of us who are watching either live on Arts and Minds Live or recorded later on our YouTube channel. My name is Dr. Michelle DiMarzo. I'm the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Sarah Churchill, in a lecture that we invited her to give in connection with the exhibition For Which It Stands, which is on view in both of our galleries through July 2026. And for those of you here this evening, the show will be open down the hall in the Walsh Gallery until 8 p.m., as well as in the Bellarmine Hall galleries until 8 p.m. I'd be like that every Thursday. Sarah Churchill is an adjunct lecturer here at Fairfield University, and she's a historian of modern and contemporary art and visual culture. Her research examines the ways in which images and the institutions that frame them shape perceptions of social life, collective memory, and spatial justice. She earned her PhD in cultural history from Drew University and her MPhil in art history from Trinity College, Dublin. Most recently, she held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, and she will soon serve as the inaugural photography fellow at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal this summer. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Churchill.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thanks to everyone at the Fairfield University Art Museum and the Quick Center for hosting me today. And I want to wish all of you a happy Black History Month. I feel compelled in this moment to sort of remind us all that Black history, of course, is American history. It's our history. And so I'm really delighted to be talking about African art and visual culture and photography with everyone here today. And to also be reflecting on what I think is a very important and timely exhibition being hosted by my colleagues at the Fairfield University Art Museum, the exhibition For Which It Stands. And I hope you've all had a chance to see this exhibition because it's going to be sort of our jumping off point for my lecture this evening. The inspiration for what I'm going to be talking about today really comes from this photograph here. I was really gratified to be invited by my colleagues at the museum to contribute an interpretation of this photograph, Dred Scott's Emancipation Proclamation, a work which reminds us that the hard work of liberation remains regrettably an ongoing project for many. Produced in June of 2020, Emancipation Proclamation followed a global pandemic and a national reckoning with systemic racism in the United States. In the photograph, Scott viscerally protests the extrajudicial murder of unarmed Black men at the hands of police. Here, Old Glory is burning, literally and metaphorically, with Scott's anguished indignation. In what follows, I'd like to think through the photographic milieu in which Emancipation Proclamation sits and trace the path of liberation and resistance in and through Black photography in America. I offer you an incomplete history of Black photography, but one which I hope helps us to both appreciate the historic cycles of racial violence that remain in many ways dangerously present in our culture, while celebrating also the beautiful futures that Black photography makes possible. I'm going to accomplish this goal by going through Black photography in 4 phases of development to help us think through how photography has emerged in this moment. So we'll think about abolition, Reconstruction, civil rights struggles, and finally new futures. So let us begin first by picturing abolition. In this first phase of Black photography and the path to liberation, we're going to think through the beginnings of the process in which the image of Black Americans was wrested and reclaimed from its racist origins. We're also going to think about photography as a tool of empowerment and a means for Black Americans to control their own representation. We will also consider photography as evidence of slavery's cruelty and the ways in which it was exploited as an incitement to fight in the Civil War. Finally, we'll look at an example in which photographs were used as fundraising for abolition. There are a few better places to start than with the writer and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who was among the most photographed Americans in the 19th century, and an early theorist of photography, speaking at least 4 times on photography's significance and its role in individual uplift and social reform. Pictured here is the first known photographic portrait of Frederick Douglass, taken a year after the first commercial daguerreotype studio opened in 1841. When this image was taken, the exposure time for daguerreotypes of this size could run up to 15 seconds. It's as if his presence has quite literally grown into the silver-coated copper plate onto which the image is registered. Douglass sat for at least 160 photographed portraits, a calculated attempt engineered to challenge racist stereotypes. Through photography, Douglass projected dignity, humanity, and strength, appearing in more images than even Abraham Lincoln. As Douglass noted in The Liberator on April 20th of 1849, no Black American can have a, quote, impartial portrait at the hands of any white artists. Quote, "It seems to us next to impossible for white men to take likenesses of Black men without most grossly exaggerating their distinctive features." End quote. Of course, the war of images which Douglass sought to wage was not only about illustrated caricatures like these, but also about the weaponization of early anthropological photography in support of racist pseudo-scientific theories, such as those perpetuated by Louis Agassiz, founder of Harvard University's Museum of Comparative Zoology. Photographs like this portrait of Jack were commissioned to document enslaved persons in North Carolina and evidence the mastery and superiority of whiteness through photography. Notably, the subjects were stripped naked, robbed of their dignity, and of any opportunity consent to having their likeness recorded. Nudity would be exceptionally uncommon in such portraiture, indicating an understanding on the part of the photographer and of Agassiz of their subjects' supposedly inferior social status. I'm happy to share with you that after a 6-year legal battle, Tamara Lanier, who's a descendant of 2 of the people photographed in this series, Delia and her father Renty, she has won her battle in Harvard and won the return of 2 of the daguerreotypes just recently in May of 2025, which indicates that the story of these images is still unfolding. Now, the first of Douglass's lectures on photography were delivered during the Civil War, a war in which the photography played a significant role in the shaping of that event in what became the first living room war. In the lecture called Pictures in Progress, Douglass argued, "We have pictures, true pictures, of every object which can interest us. Men of all conditions and classes can now see themselves as others have seen them, and as they will be seen by those who shall come after them. What was once the special and exclusive luxury of the rich and the great is now the privilege of all. The humblest servant girl may now possess a picture of herself, such as the wealth of kings could not have purchased 50 years ago." Pictures in Progress represents Douglass's most sustained examination of the connection between art and reform, wherein he's thinking particularly about photography as a tool and a weapon in an ideological war to end not just slavery, but racism more broadly. Through culture and through pictures, one could have their mind changed, and the cruel distance between stereotype and reality could be closed. In March of 1963, a man known only as Peter escaped from bondage on a Louisiana plantation, and after a harrowing journey, found safety among Union soldiers and camped at Baton Rouge. Under the Confiscation Act of 1862, he was granted his freedom. Before enlisting in a black regiment and fighting in the Civil War, he was examined by military doctors who discovered the horrific scarring on his back, a result of the vicious whipping by an overseer. The photograph depicted here documented Peter's condition, and it created a sensation when it reached the public, quickly becoming one of the most powerful proofs of slavery's brutality. As one journalist declared, quote, "This card photograph should be multiplied by 100,000 times and scattered over the states. It tells the story in a way that even Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe cannot approach, because it tells the story to the eye. Mass production of such images aided the cause of the abolition and of the Union. His example, pictured here, which was published as an illustration in Harper's Weekly, also inspired many free blacks in the North to enlist. Born Isabella Baumfree in Ulster County, New York, Sojourner Truth, who is photographed here, has sat for one of the war's most iconic portraits, likely in a studio in Detroit. The 67-year-old abolitionist, who never learned to read or write, pauses from her knitting and looks pensively at us through the camera's lens. She was an anti-slavery activist, a colleague of Frederick Douglass, a memoirist, and a committed feminist, who shows herself here engaged in the dignity of women's work. Truth sold this card to promote and raise money for her many causes. At a human rights convention, she was said to have commented that she used to be sold for the benefit of others, but now she sold her own likeness for her own. So we move now into the phase known as Reconstruction, in which photography functioned as a kind of counter-archive. And in this period, photography reemerged to weaponize itself against freed blacks by stereotyping them as convicts or buffoons, but also in ways that reinforced the racial terror against Black Americans through photography of their own murder and torture. I want to note that I will not be showing any photographs of that nature today. In this period, though, there was also a shift from defense to offense by Black activists who were focusing more acutely on the construction of their own self-image and actualization outside of the dominant white gaze. The home and the snapshot also function in this period as powerful and important counter-archives. Likewise, Black photographic studios emerged in which the rising Black middle classes could have their own images documented in a way that emphasized their respectability, their education, their financial success, and also their pride. After the war, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, abolished slavery across the nation, established due process, and redefined citizenship by birth, extending voting rights to Black men. Additionally, laws and social customs emerged which reinforced white supremacy and a system of separate but equal segregation known as Jim Crow society. Newly emancipated African Americans quickly understood they needed to participate in both the legislative system and the court system to enlarge and protect their opportunities as citizens. While some Americans found success as professionals, others were forced into restrictive labor contracts as sharecroppers, and some were even forced to labor as convicts. All would become conscious of the continuation of racial terror soon to be exercised against them. James Palmer, who took the image represented here, was an Irish emigre to the United States who had served in the Civil War and specialized in photographs of Black communities in the South. He took portraits as well as images of homes and scenes from cotton fields and other locations where they were working. Palmer's stereographs provide important information about how both the white South Carolinians and newly emancipated persons adjusted to the new life they were living. While Palmer was deeply sympathetic, the photographs nonetheless embody a white gaze, as his subjects rarely, if ever, share physical space with whites. Nonetheless, such photographs importantly document life under Reconstruction. In this example, a woman is depicted reading to children, an activity that would have been illegal prior to emancipation. Such photographs function as essential counterweights to the racial stereotyping that emerges in early American photography. Examples include like this one, Sigmund Krause's image for the Street Types and Great American Cities book that he produced in 1896. Before it became a racist stereotype in Jim Crow era, watermelon once symbolized self-sufficiency among African Americans. Following emancipation, many Southern African Americans grew and sold watermelons, and it actually became a symbol of their freedom. Many Southern whites reacted to this self-sufficiency by turning the fruit into a symbol of poverty. Watermelons came to symbolize a feast for the, quote, lazy and childlike. To shame Black Americans, popular ads and ephemera, including postcards, featured African Americans stealing, fighting over, or sitting in the streets enjoying watermelon. Krause's book of photographs borrow the evidentiary status of photography and the emerging genre of documentary photography specifically to depict this young child enjoying watermelon. However, the photographs in his text are posed, they're in a studio, and thus they are composed and controlled by Krause's vision, reflective of his own biased perceptions. The book and its imagery thus reflect the nativist-tinged disdain for immigrants and persons of color in the period, whose presence in American cities produced much tension and competition for jobs and housing. After the passage of the 13th Amendment, involuntary servitude was abolished, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Soon after, states began passing laws that were known as Black Codes, leading to mass incarceration of Black individuals. The system of convict leasing, which began shortly after the Civil War, in some cases led to prisoners working on the same lands and for the same people that had previously enslaved them. In 1898, some 73% of Alabama's annual state revenue reportedly came from convict leasing. The practice was eventually abolished in the 1930s, but was replaced by chain gangs like the one seen here, a practice which persisted into the 1950s. In photography, the depiction of incarcerated persons reinforced the stereotyping of Black men as lawless or dangerous, and was one of the many ways by which photographs were weaponized to define Blackness on negative terms. I want to turn now to the image that is associated with racial terror and reiterate that I won't be showing any images of lynchings today. I will, however, reflect briefly on a contemporary image by an artist named Ken Day, who explicitly addresses the legacy of lynching in visual culture. Lynching of African Americans was terrorism deployed to enforce racial subordination and segregation. Lynchings were violent public events that traumatized Black people and were largely tolerated by state and federal officials. Some 4,400 individuals were killed in racial terror lynchings in 12 southern states between about 1877 and 1950. Outside the South, an additional 300 murders have been documented to date. White newspapers advertised these carnival-like events. Vendors sold food, and photographers printed postcards, while victims' clothing and body parts were sometimes given out as grim souvenirs. Photographs documenting these events also circulated as grim reinforcement of the racial terror and souvenirs of violent white supremacy. Looking to Ken Day's series Erased Lynching, we see how Ken is using these images by refocusing attention on to the perpetrators of racial violence. He does this by erasing the violence in the photograph so that we can refocus on the people depicted below. The absence here is designed to resist the re-victimization of those who were murdered, and it focuses our attention on the perpetrators of the violence and the mechanisms that undercut the violent racism that drove these acts of terror. Day's project addresses a hidden history of lynching in California, which encompassed not only Black Americans, but also the murder of Latinx, Asian, and Native American victims also. In 1900, under the leadership of W.E.B. Du Bois, the writer, editor, and co-founder of the NAACP, an exhibition of Black life was organized as part of the Paris's World Fair in 1900, with the goal of demonstrating the progress and oppression of Black people in the United States. Du Bois and his colleagues used cutting-edge sociological techniques to present a compelling message about African Americans to an international audience, conducting both quantitative research and qualitative research, and utilizing descriptive sources like photographs, scrapbooks, and other documentation of Black life. Examples include some of those depicted here, which were among some 500 photographs of African American men and women, including their homes, churches, businesses, and landscapes. While some of these photographs were posed, others include more informal snapshots. The photo albums that Du Bois compiled and displayed included no captions and no markers. Rather, he arranged them as a visual record of Black life that could reference itself. James Van der Zee, who's among the most notable portraitists of Black life in the period, opened his first studio, the Guarantee Portrait Studio in Harlem in 1917. He photographed the people who lived in Harlem, including its famous entertainers, its artists, its leaders, and a growing Black middle class. He also took his camera to the places that they called their own, including their homes, billiards, barbershops, churches, and clubs. Van der Zee's work forms an important chronicle of Black life in the period. The family depicted here was associated with Marcus Garvey's movement, known as the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA. The UNIA advocated for Black Americans and others among the African diaspora to return to Africa and populate and develop Liberia, the only nation on the continent that had never been colonized. Van der Zee was also hired by the UNIA to record and document its marches, parades, and members who adopted a quasi-militaristic appearance. The UNIA became a mass movement of over 200,000 members during the 1920s, a time when the Ku Klux Klan had reemerged as a white nationalist group. The UNIA represented the largest mass movement in African American history, and Garvey wanted African Americans to see themselves as members of a mighty race, and so such images function as an important aid in the struggle for self-representation. Likewise, the snapshot was an important tool in the functioning of this counter-archive. The earliest handheld cameras transformed how Black families would see themselves, democratizing access to intimate portraiture and creating some of the first sustained domestic family archives. Eastman Kodak released its first, most recognized handheld brand, the Kodak Brownie, in 1900. It was a basic box camera with preloaded film that sold for $1. Although originally developed for children, adults soon became its most avid consumers. And by the end of 1905, Kodak had sold 1.2 million Brownie cameras. Originally, photography was not explicitly marketed to Black audiences. The first advertising agency specializing in Black advertising did not actually emerge until about the 1940s, and venues for those ads, like Jet and Ebony, appeared shortly thereafter. But by at least the 1970s, we do see an attempt of companies like Kodak to target this demographic of Black photographers, particularly in magazines like Ebony. In fact, the first Black Santa Claus was featured in an advertisement for the Kodak Pocket Instamatic camera in 1972. Importantly, cameras produced an archive that could be transportable and hidden if necessary. These were considered by the writer Bell Hooks to be a, quote, powerful tool of cultural recovery and an important counter-archive. Photographic technology, however, was not originally made for darker skin. It was engineered to record whiteness, and thus darker skin was either too dark to be seen clearly, or it was mechanically lightened in some examples of commercial photography. Snapshots, by contrast, were unadulterated images, and as Bell Hooks has argued, they gave us a way to see ourselves, a sense of how we looked when we were not wearing the mask, when we were not attempting to perfect the image for a white supremacist gaze. As Hooks continues, quote, using images, we connect ourselves to a recuperative, redemptive memory that enables us to construct racial identities, image of ourselves that transcend the limits of the colonizing eye. We move now into the period of the civil rights struggle, where we think about pictures in protest and how they work together. In this period, we have the rise of photojournalism, where photographs function not only as evidence, but also as empathetic witness. We also have in this period the rise of a professional class of Black photographers and also more working class photographers who benefited from government programs like the Farm Security Administration and WPA programs, but also the GI Bill as well. We also in this period see the rise of the first Black photographer to win the Pulitzer Prize for photography, Moneta Sleet Jr. Photography in this period documents iconic events in the civil rights struggle, images which remain indelible in our memory. It's also in this period that we can think about the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the importance of digital photography as witness in their goals as well. We'll begin with Gordon Parks and what is perhaps one of the most iconic photographs that he ever took of Ella Watson, also known as American Gothic. Self-taught photographer, Parks was raised in a segregated Midwest home and ran a portrait business in Chicago. He arrived in Washington in 1942 as one of the only Black persons to work for the Farm Security Administration. And it was there that Mr. Parks discovered how deeply segregated our nation's capital still was. In a single day, he was refused service at restaurants, barred from a theater, and dismissed by a department store clerk. His mentor, Roy Stryker, who ran the Farm Security Administration, encouraged him not to give up and suggested he speak to other Black people who had lived their lives there. Taking Stryker's advice, Parks struck up a conversation with Ella Watson, who was a member of the cleaning staff at the FSA. And over the course of an hour, she took him through what he described later as a lifetime of drudgery and despair. Parks then asked her to stand with her mop and broom before a huge American flag, saying, "Now, think of what you told me and look into the camera." That striking photo, now known as American Gothic, became one of his most famous and enduring expressions of outrage at America's treatment of Black folks. Parks would, of course, go on to have a long and very prolific career as a photojournalist, working for popular magazines like Life magazine. Just after the Supreme Court's Brown versus the Board of Education ruled segregation unconstitutional, the Jim Crow ethos, Life magazine sent Gordon Parks to the South to document the fallout. Parks photographed 4 generations of the Thornton family, which were based in and around Mobile, Alabama, and Nashville, Tennessee, and found that their lives remained very much still separate and still unequal. 26 of Parks's images appeared alongside an accompanying article in late September issue of Life in 1956, including this image depicted here of a 6-year-old Shirley and her aunt standing outside a coloreds-only entrance at the local department store. Parks had an uncanny talent for finding the universal in the particular, for speaking poetically to a poorly informed middle-class audience. He also strategically used color film at a time when it was still considered largely unserious for most photojournalists. For Parks, photography was a deeply personal response to injustice. He said, quote, "I picked up a camera because it was my choice of weapons against what I hated most in the universe: racism, intolerance, and poverty. I could have just as easily picked up a knife or a gun like many of my childhood friends did, most of whom were murdered or put in prison. But I chose not to go that way. I felt that I could somehow subdue these evils by doing something beautiful that people recognize me by, and thus make a whole different life for myself, which has proven to be true." Emmett Till, age 14, was brutally murdered on August 28, 1955, for allegedly whistling at a white woman in Money, Mississippi, a claim that was later retracted. An all-white jury acquitted his killers the following September, and the verdict aroused international protest. But it was the publication of a searing image photographed by David Jackson and published in Jet magazine. This stoic depiction of Emmett's mother, Mamie Till, gazing at her murdered child's ravaged body, that forced the world to reckon with the brutality of American racism. Of her decision to share the photos with the world, Mrs. Till said, "Let the people see what I have seen." Years later, Jesse Jackson asked the activist Rosa Parks why she refused to move to the back of the bus during the Alabama bus boycotts. Parks replied, "I thought of Emmett Till and I couldn't go back." The photograph is just one of many images that galvanized a coalition of support for the broader civil rights movement. Another image we might consider in this vein is the photograph of King's arrest taken by Charles Moore. Moore was a white photographer. He studied photography under the GI Bill and worked for the Montgomery Advertiser at the start of what became the Civil Rights Movement. His iconic 1958 photograph captures Martin Luther King's arrest for loitering and shows King dressed in a suit with his arm twisted behind his back while his wife Coretta watches. The photo documents the intense hostility faced by civil rights activists, which was also exploited to foster negative views of King at the time, though it later became a very powerful symbol of resistance. We perhaps know Charles Moore's work best through his photographs of the Children's Crusade in 1963, when more than 1,000 children stayed out of school to march in Birmingham. Moore arrived there when he heard reports of attacks on the demonstrators, and he immediately began documenting the events. His photos show the Birmingham Fire Department spraying demonstrators with their pressure hoses and policemen releasing dogs on the demonstrators. These photos were in Life and Times, and their publication ultimately helped to turn public sympathies. Trained in photography in the Army and working as a photojournalist, Ernest Withers also reported on the Till trial. This photograph, taken during the Memphis sanitation workers' strike of 1968, is one of the most recognizable images from the civil rights movement. At the time of the strike, racial tensions were high over inequalities in pay and distribution of work and opportunities for advancement, which tended to run along racial lines. When 2 Black men died on the job and their families received only $500 in funeral expenses, the workers had had enough and they went on strike. They were supported by organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating, with them rallying behind them. As a resident in Memphis and an influential member of its Black community, Ernest Withers helped to plan the march. In fact, he even helped to make some of the iconic I Am a Man signs that we see pictured here. This image is made more important and poignant because the strike took place roughly a week before the assassination of one of its champions, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. The importance of photography as a record of injustice and a testament to the power and organized political protest has only become more important since the advent of digital camera phone photography. The last frontier of photography's democratization, the first digital cameras became commercially available in the 1990s, and by around 2000, they were widely available in cell phones, and of course since become ubiquitous. Artists like LaToya Ruby Frazier and her Flint is Family from 2016 have very much married the tradition of documentary photography with a perspective rooted in intimate snapshots. Frazier was raised in one of the poorest neighborhoods in post-industrial Braddock, Pennsylvania, which has inspired her to document themes of poverty, industrial pollution, and chronic disinvestment in Black communities. Gordon Parks is for her an important reference point, particularly given the social documentary function of her photographs. However, Frazier is also directly addressing the question of invisibility of Black struggle in society by making inequality visible and tangible for white audiences in places like the Museum of Modern Art, where a recent retrospective of her work was held. Her photography captures what it's like to live in the dark shadows of industrial capitalism. Drawing parallels to her experience growing up in Braddock, Frazier's work, particularly in this project, Flint is Family, confronts environmental racism and healthcare inequities in the United States. As Frazier explains, it rocked me to the core to see that in America we can go from fountains that say whites or Blacks only to today seeing fountains that say contaminated water, do not drink. And somehow that's acceptable. For Frazier, of course, it was not. Using the commissions from this project, Frazier funded the installation of an atmospheric water generator, bringing 120,000 gallons of free, clean drinking water to the people of Flint. Finally, the Black Lives Matter organization, which was founded by Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, was created with the, quote, goal to build the kind of society where Black people can live with dignity and respect, end quote. BLM emerged as a space to address systemic racism and police brutality that was encountered in Black communities, particularly following the 2012 murder of the 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. The social media movement that emerged from this injustice has come to rely most powerfully on digital photography for its fuel. Digital photographs, however, we should note, are something of a poisoned chalice. On the one hand, state surveillance has the potential to be used as retaliation against protesters. On the other, technology has given supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement a louder and more collective voice, as well as the ability to easily record footage of police brutality. In fact, it's the circulation of this information and imagery that has led to the intersectional demand for accountability since 2020. Besides naming and shaming and raising awareness, evidence recorded at protests has since functioned in open source investigations who use digital verification tools to try and identify violent officers. I want to turn now to think about how contemporary photography is imagining new futures and how images are functioning as a form of visual medicine. In this era, we might think of contemporary photographers as absorbing the long history of Black photography and thinking through the lessons that have been gleaned in the struggle for liberation. They're noting particularly the influence of the civil rights movement in photography, but also the collapse of colonization more broadly. What we might note in this period is that we see photographs in a kind of conversation with the past, but we also see the invention of new visual languages. We also see the emergence of the photographer exploring their own likeness as subject, so many autobiographical examples could be included in this period. Additionally, we can celebrate the institutionalization of Black photography through the coming together and coordination and community of different organizations. We also see a strong tradition coming out of the counter archive that was built in the preceding era. Finally, in this period, we might think through photography as a means of processing past traumas and also forging new and more hopeful futures. An important touchstone in this era would be Roy DeCarava, who was a pioneering Black social documentary photographer. In this project, known as the Sweet Flypaper of Life, we see an important touchstone for other photographers that follow. DeCarava was born in Harlem and came of age during its Renaissance. In 1952, he became the first Black photographer to receive a Guggenheim Fellowship, and he spent the next year taking about 2,000 photographs of daily life in Harlem, where he was accepted and where the subjects he photographed exhibited little self-consciousness. At the time, publishers were not interested in standalone photography books. This is, we might note, prior to the publication of Robert Frank's seminal Americans, which would change all of that in 1960. The subtle beauty and emphasis on Blackness, both in terms culturally, but also in terms of the darkness that we see in his photographs, was at odds with conventional, one-dimensional portrayals of Black life. Hughes, whom he collaborated with on this project, a successful poet, persuaded Simon & Schuster to publish these images under condition that Hughes would provide a poem to accompany them. This narrative poem embodied a fictional woman named Sister Mary Bradley, a grandmother of 10 living in Harlem. She reads an intimate window into Harlem life. The book was small and included 150 of DeCarava's photographs. It was received to great acclaim and is listed as one of the Times' best books of that year. The first print run sold out, and it has since been reissued several times, most recently by the Zwirner Gallery. This series represented a new representational practice in which Black culture saw itself as both beautifully quotidian and also extraordinary. The project should be understood as not merely a sociological statement, but a quest for DeCarava's creative expression through the photographic medium. In 1963, DeCarava helped to co-found and become a director of the Camoigne Workshop, a Harlem-based collective that supported the work of Black photographers through exhibitions, public programs, group critiques, and published portfolios. The Camouflage Workshop, a collective of influential African-American photographers formed during the Civil Rights Movement, was born out of a hope of creating a support system for producing, displaying, and archiving photographs in the face of their rejection from nearly every established institution. Camouflage can be translated as to a group of people who are working together, and this comes from the Kikuyu language, which is spoken primarily in Kenya. Ming Smith, who is pictured here on the lower left-hand side of the photograph, would go on to become one of the first Black female photographers to have her work acquired by the Museum of Modern Art. Lorraine O'Grady's Art is a joyful performance in Harlem's African American Day Parade from September of 1983, and it's one of O'Grady's most successful pieces. Its impetus had been an answer to the challenge that avant-garde didn't have anything to do with Black life and culture. O'Grady's Dada-esque response was to put avant-garde art into the largest Black space she could think of. Rather than an invasion, though, Dada here functions as more of a crashing of the party. O'Grady mounted a 9 by 15-foot antique-styled gold frame on a gold-skirted float and moved it slowly up Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, framing everything it passed as art. In a character known as Mademoiselle Bourgeoisie Noire, a persona O'Grady adopted in the years prior as a guise enabling her to crash art world events and draw attention to issues of racial underrepresentation, O'Grady and 15 young actors and dancers dressed in white framed viewers with empty gold picture frames. The gesture points to the ways in which framing also works through a process of self-selection and exclusion. Choosing your frame is a potent means of self-representation. Carrie Mae Weems is perhaps best known for her seminal Kitchen Table series, but here the artist deconstructs the ethnographic gaze that has long trailed Black subjects. In this project, known as From Here I Saw, she's revisiting Zeeley's seminal photographic project. When we're looking at these images, Weems has argued, we're looking at the ways in which Anglo-America, white America, saw itself in relation to the Black subject. Weems' appropriation of the Zeeley Agassiz daguerreotypes is bookended by images of royal Mangbutu women witnessing the narrative. Through her presentation, Weems asks us about the questions of intention that lie behind these pictures and their dissemination. She enlarged, cropped, and tinted the original images and placed them in circular mats that suggest the camera's lens and emphasize acts of framing and looking. Finally, she overlays these images with her own text that expose a long history of systemic injustice. She says, and I quote, "I wanted to intervene in that by giving a voice to a subject that historically has had no voice," end quote. Coming back to the theme of the exhibition that we're all here to celebrate, I wanted to look at Alana Aratam's How to Make a Country. Inspired by 17th century Renaissance lighting, early Black studio photography, and historical narratives, this work may reference Grace Wisher, an indentured African-American servant in the household of Mary Pickersgill, who was later credited as sewing the Star-Spangled Banner that flew over Fort McHenry in Maryland, inspiring our national anthem. Examples like these are another strategy in the formation of the counter-archive, in which contemporary artists might use photography as a means of commemorating figures lost to history. In pop culture, too, we see the influence of Black photography and resistance. Kendrick Lamar's music video for Element, which comes from the album Damn, which came out in 2017, utilized a borrowing or appropriation of Gordon Parks' photography. The entire video is, in fact, a tribute to Gordon Parks' work. In response, the Park Foundation opened, quote, Element, Gordon Parks, and Kendrick Lamar as an exhibition that unites Parks' images with those from the video. Lamar's own music examines a similar agenda to Parks in his unapologetically Black sound, political subject matter, and purposeful visuals that frequently comment on race in America and the issue of mass incarceration. The video, appropriating photography from parks, appears to trace the journey of Black men in America and the violence that they must learn to navigate. The image, noted as untitled, which is pictured here at the top, is taken directly from Gordon Parks' archive. In a series shot in Alabama in 1956, the artist photographed a child pointing and aiming his toy in a deprived neighborhood behind a barbed fence. In the video for Element, the scene is extended and you watch the presumed target cross the screen as the child with the gun squints and closes his eyes to focus closely, following him with the barrel as his friends look on with mild concern. The message seems to address the brutalization of children of color through crime and institutionalized racism, particularly in the age of Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin. I want to conclude now with a more hopeful image by looking at Michael Owuna's James from the Infinite Essence series in 2018. Michael Owuna's Infinite Essence series, you see black bodies floating through an inky void. Their forms constitute the universe itself. They're speckled with warm, vibrant, and seemingly infinite constellations. Owuna explains that with this series, he's, quote, set about on a quest to recast the black body as the cosmos and the eternal, end quote. Hand painting his models' bodies with fluorescent paints, Owuna has engineered a standard camera flash with an ultraviolet band pass filter, photographing only the ultraviolet light in the frame. Illuminating his models as universes, Owuna depicts, quote, the beauty of the soul and our deeper cosmic connections communicated through them, end quote. In a pointed critique of the pervasive media portrayal of Black men as victims or victimizers, the Infinite Essence series instead imagines the Black body as a source of ethereal light and life in the universe. As the Afrofuturist novelist Octavia Butler has argued, our destiny is to, quote, take root among the stars. Photography realizes something metaphorically similar in this project, that we are not bound to the earth or constrained by the sins of the past. Rather, we are free to imagine new futures. And I'll leave it there. Thank you all so much.
Well, I'll start. Thank you so much for that, which was incredibly broad, incredibly deep. And I know from your remarks beforehand, you cut a lot of favorites you would have liked to include. And yet you had such a striking range of images that you chose. I do have a sort of a technical question going back to the daguerreotypes. I noticed one was called a sixth plate and one was called a ninth plate. And in a very general way, what is the distinction between those two?
I think it's just size. Yeah, so I don't know the exact specifications, but it has to do with the
like a sixth of a plate versus
of
a plate. Okay.
It's sort of like a standardized plate in terms of the different sizes. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I'm just wondering if you can explain what you mean by a counter archive. I know I've heard this term before, but I'm just not quite up on my theory.
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about the counter archive, we're thinking about a means of countering what would be considered the institutional depiction of Black life, which tends to be dominated by racist imagery and formulated in a way that does not respect the diversity of Black life. So the counter archive is a kind of explicit strategy that we see across portraiture, snapshot photography, and also now artists' work that is directly refuting that representation and speaking back against it. Yeah. Thanks, Eva. Thank you. Thank you all so much.